I'm curious what you think. Is this logo racist? The teepee specifically, is that a racist symbol? What about the name, Camp Minneowi? Is that a racist term? Is it a culturally appropriated term, an image? Is this image problematic, as is fashionable to say nowadays? These questions seem to have come up recently, and we got this email the other day that strongly suggests that someone is suggesting that there is a problem with this logo and with the name, and they are asking people to participate in what they call a name and logo listening circle, or listening circles as it's called. So I'm making this video primarily to give some feedback to the camp, to give some feedback to Rich Burch and his team and the people who are looking at this. And if you're associated with Camp Minneowi, I know some of you who watch this have sent children and grandchildren to this camp, and there's a real extended community of people that have been to Camp Minneowi over the years. In my own church, there's a woman who's in her 70s, I believe, and she mentioned having gone to Camp Minneowi as, I guess, as a youth. I can't remember how old, like maybe 13 or 14 years old, I assume. So there's a lot of memories in a wider community. So I don't know where this is coming from. I'm not sure if someone's accused them of being racist. I can only go by what is here. But I think there are some clues just in the language that they use that give some clues about what's being levied against them. So they talk about how, for nearly 8 decades, I think 77 years or so, they've been doing camp ministry. It's a Christian camp, if I didn't say that already. Tens of thousands of children and young people have gone. And they say here in bold, we're initiating a period of introspection rooted in our desire to ensure our branding reflects the respect, understanding, and values we hold dear. Okay, fair enough. They want to make sure that their branding comports with their values. That, I guess, makes sense. Although it does raise at least one question. As far as I know, their values have stayed the same for many years, all the years that I've known them. And I think they've largely stayed the same since they've had this name and logo. So I wonder what makes them think that now, 77 years later, their name and logo is maybe out of alignment with their values. That's an interesting question. The name Camp Minneowi and use of teepee imagery is associated with countless memories, life lessons, and personal transformations. However, with the growing awareness of the painful histories of residential schools in Canada and the undeniable fact that our branding drew from Indigenous cultures without proper understanding or permission, it has become imperative for us to introspect. My concern with this whole thing, frankly, well, let me say what I think might be right about this. And perhaps it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. This is a Christian camp. They are aligning themselves with the person, ways, and teaching of Jesus, which I think is great. And Jesus himself talks a lot about being compassionate, putting others first, loving people, loving our enemies even. So the whole idea of compassion toward other people is really core to his message. So I think that, if there's some hint that maybe this logo or name is not being compassionate to certain people, that perhaps that is worth a look. Of course, that's not all that Jesus taught. In fact, he taught us that the ways of his kingdom are at odds with the ways of this world. He talks about, sending his disciples into the world, and warns them to be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves. The idea being that gentleness, that compassion is there, but also to be discerning, because as the Apostle John warns us, not every spirit that has gone into the world is from God, and that we're to test the spirits. And I think that's what we need to do here. What's being implied here, what I think maybe is behind a lot of this, is something that I saw when I was at university. It was actually quite pervasive. I saw it in a lot of the reading we did. And it's what I've called, and I don't think I made up this term, I'm sure others have used it, but this narrative of the oppressor and the oppressed. And what I mean by that narrative, and it comes in many different shapes and forms, and it has roots in Antonio Gramsci and others. It has roots in what's called liberation theology, which I don't think is good theology in general, but I'll put that aside. And that's this idea that the world is divided into two kinds of people: those of the category who oppress and those in the category who are oppressed. And depending on what type of, like how you deploy this narrative, it can go between immigrant and non-immigrant. It could be like these classes of oppressor and oppressed could be done by skin color, by language, by sexual orientation. But it's this idea that we first belong to a category based on one of these items, and then that category itself is either an oppressor class or an oppressed class. And what follows from that is that we need to treat people in different classes differently based on their membership in that class. And in my view, that's antithetical to the gospel. That's a different kind of gospel. Jesus, in his gospel, he met with individual people. Like when he met Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee, he wasn't trying to correct everything about the Pharisees as a group. He was meeting with Nicodemus specifically. The Gospels are full of these events where he meets the rich young ruler. He's dealing not necessarily with all rich people, but that particular one in that moment. He meets a woman at the well. He engages with her, though he has something to say about, there's a discussion about how her people worship and how Jesus's people worship. His ultimate message is that everyone will worship in truth. Anyway, the point is, Jesus seems interested first in the individual and his relationship with that individual, and things like race and class are secondary. The Apostle Paul himself tells us that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, that those labels are not important when we have our identity in Christ. Now, it seems to me that the narrative here is this oppressor-oppressed narrative. And the reason I say that, and again, I don't know this for sure, I could be wrong, but I've seen this pattern at school, I've seen it in our culture, and I think I'm seeing it here, but I'm open to be corrected if it's not indeed the case. Specifically, what they're sort of saying is, we had this identity, we had this name, and that was fine, but there's growing awareness of painful histories of residential schools in Canada. So it sounds like what they might be saying is, because there is a group of people called Indigenous people who have been harmed historically, which I believe is true, I'm not saying that's not true, that as a class, Indigenous people are the oppressed. And in this narrative, by extension, Christians, European descendant Canadians, let's say, which I think is why Camp Minneowi is perhaps getting drawn into this, that somehow represents European people. And so because Minneowi is Christian or represents European heritage, let's say, although I don't think it does, but I don't think that's a good way to frame it, but I'll put that aside, that organizations like Minneowi there represent the oppressor, and then Indigenous people have been oppressed. And then what follows is, now that we recognize that, the oppressed get to basically assert their will, or their opinion is given more weight over that of the oppressor. And it goes on, so residential schools, okay, and this is interesting. And they say there's the undeniable fact that our branding drew from Indigenous cultures. I don't disagree with that from what I've read on their website. I mean, a teepee, it's, I guess, an Indigenous form of lodging. I think it's unique to what I think of the people of the plains. I could have that wrong, so it's perhaps not appropriate for Ontario, but that's sort of beside the point. It's a symbol. Certainly it's of Indigenous nature, although I imagine there's lots of peoples who dwelt in tents that are maybe similar, but that's beside the point. And the name Minneowi, according to their website, I can't remember where it is, but I might have this wrong. Oh, here it is. That it, oh no, it's something else. But it roughly translates to like fountain of living waters, which is a biblical allusion, which is arguably of a different culture altogether, of first century Judaism, but I'll put that aside. And I think it's in the Sioux Dakota language that Minneyowi translates roughly to that. Anyway, this next part's interesting. So the undeniable fact that our branding drew from indigenous cultures, I don't disagree, without proper understanding or permission. Now that's interesting, because what that suggests is that somehow it's incumbent upon Minneyowi to fully understand and get permission from someone before using these cultural symbols, which I want to be kind here, but it's kind of absurd on the face. We don't need permission from different cultures to use symbols and languages and things that people don't have. It's not like it's copywritten kind of thing. I noticed on Camp Minneyowi's website, it's written in English. English is from England. Do we need to seek the permission from King Charles to be able to use that? I noticed that their phone number is on here. It's written in numerals. Those are Arabic numerals. Do we need to get permission from the Arabs before using these symbols? I noticed at Minneyowi that there's lots of canoes. Mostly, I think, aluminum, maybe fiberglass. But the shape of a canoe, that's an indigenous mode of transportation. Do we need to seek permission from the ancestors of the people who developed these technologies? Of course not. I mean, we can go on and on. There's all kinds of things you could imagine. There could be different symbols. Maybe they want to celebrate Dutch heritage, so there's a windmill, or it's Scottish heritage and they use different tartans or something like that. You don't need to seek permission from Scots or from the Dutch to use that. So this idea that we need permission somehow, to me, doesn't follow. It doesn't make sense. And the full understanding is probably true. In fact, it's probably true even now that most people don't have a full understanding of the significance of a teepee. I certainly don't. What does full understanding mean, and why do we need to have that before we use something? Well, using the example of numerals, most people probably don't know that the numerals we use are of Arabic origin. You can still use them for your phone number. You don't need a full understanding of where everything comes from. We think of the faith. Camp Minneyowi is a Christian camp where I believe what they're doing is they are sharing the message of Jesus. I believe that God, through Jesus, is calling people to himself. And to get started in that walk of faith, you don't have to have full understanding. In fact, none of us can have full understanding of God and his ways, but he calls us into a relationship. So start where we are. So why we need a full understanding of something before we can use it just doesn't make sense. And anyway, I want to get back to the message behind what I think this might be coming from. This idea of the oppressed and the oppressor. Again, I saw this a lot in school. It's mixed in with Christian theology, which I don't think is good, and I think we need to guard against it. I don't think we need to be scared of it. It's a worldview where it's not about what you're doing as an individual, it's about what category you're in. And the solution that it seeks, I believe, as I understand it, is that if we have an oppressor class and an oppressed class, that culture, government, people in general need to shift things. They need to kind of put their thumb on the scale so that oppression goes in the other direction for a little while to even things out. That we're looking at large groups of people and saying, you're oppressed, you're an oppressor. And that's not the gospel of Jesus. His gospel is about understanding that, one, we're all created in God's image, whether we're indigenous, non-indigenous, whether we're Jewish or Gentile, whether we're male or female, that each of us is created in the image of God. So in that sense, and part of being created in the image of God, I believe, especially in a broken world, we are all oppressed. People have hurt us. We've been harmed by parents, by society, by friends. We've had broken relationships. We have all this hurt that is inflicted upon us. And, just as important, we perpetrate hurt on other people. In the Bible, they call this sin. And we're reminded, Paul's letter to the Romans, we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So, according to Jesus' gospel, we're all hurt by the world, and we all perpetrate hurt on others. And the solution is not to go and change logos so that people's feelings aren't hurt. The solution is to align our lives to the person, way, and teachings of Jesus, and that changes us from the inside out. And I think that what's animating these ideas, I don't want to be judgmental. I think there's probably a lot of people going into this sincerely and thinking, hey, if Camp Minneoe is doing something that's harming someone else, certainly you should stop that. If you're truly being racist or if you're truly harming. I question that this is actually causing harm, and I think it's about something else. So I would encourage you to test those spirits. And the other thing, I mean, Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, I think it's chapter 7 here, he talks about, here it is, talking about trees bearing good and bad fruit. Jesus says, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. And as best I can tell, Camp Minneoe, you're a good tree. I've seen amazing things come from you. And racism is a bad fruit. And I'm not sure how racist intentions, like how we're supposed to understand that flowing from what I've seen as being a good tree. My son was baptized there last summer with, I don't know how many other young people. I feel like it was at least 20, maybe more. And I heard testimony after testimony, young men and young women talking about how Jesus has changed their lives. It wasn't about a category of people. There was different races. There was different people of different family histories. There was lots of very compelling stories, and stories of hurt, people who had been hurt in their lives, and who have overcome that hurt by God's grace and by the power of Jesus, his death and resurrection. But each of those were individuals. It wasn't about the category of people that an individual belongs to. It's about that individual meeting the resurrected Christ and having that change their life. That's the gospel. It's about these individuals who get changed, and then after they're changed, they come together and form the church. Whereas this oppressor-oppressed narrative does the opposite. It says that, depending on what category you're in, you either have to be punished or lifted up, and that we're going to fix things through some sort of social rearranging or reordering. That's not the gospel. The gospel is about having hearts changed by the power of Jesus. And only after individuals are changed that we come together as brothers and sisters, we become the church, we are loved and we love one another, we are known and known by one another, and that's how God does his work. I've seen amazing things at Camp Minneoe over the years. We've had a number of foster kids come through our home over the years, and I feel like at least 3, I was talking to him, I think at least 3 have gone to Minneoe, and to a person, each of them was received not as a member of some ethnic group or some specific tribe or language group, but they were received as individuals, image bearers of God, and they were loved and they were met where they were. There was, I can't get into the details here, but I'll say this, there were 2 of our foster children, who had suffered a tremendous loss just prior to going to camp. And I remember talking to one of the counselors and letting them know of this, sort of a little bit of what was going on, just so they could have some extra context and provide some extra grace to these children. And you guys did an amazing job. God is at work in what you are doing. Your logo isn't harming anyone, I don't think. I can't imagine anyone who could walk the grounds of Minneoe, hear the testimony, see what's going on, and say, well, these are racists. These are people that want to hurt Indigenous people. that's not what I see. And one of the problems of this, one of the many problems I believe, is when we embark on these things where we apologize for things that were done long before we were born by people who happen to look like us, we get the feeling that we're repenting because, oh, I'm sorry that someone who looked like me in the past perpetrated something to someone who looks like you. And it can kind of feel like repentance, but it's not really, because I'm confessing someone else's sin. And it can create the feeling that I'm repenting when really I'm not. Anyway, I'm going on here. This is important. I don't think you guys are racist. I don't think your symbols are racist. I don't think they're problematic. I think Minneowi is a good tree and it's bearing good fruit. And I would encourage you, again, brothers and sisters, test the spirits, because not every spirit that goes out into the world, or not every prophet that goes out into the world, is from God. I pray that God would give you discernment as you do these listening circles, and that you would listen to Him and His calling and not be deceived by things of this world.